Hello, and my name is Heidi Swevens. I have been asked to do a guest host for the Green Mountain Disability Stories podcast, and I'm thrilled to be here with artist Karen Lloyd. So, for access, my name is Heidi Swevens. I use she, they pronouns. I'm the director of community partnerships and exhibitions with Inclusive Arts Vermont, and I'm also a disabled artist and really thrilled to be here. I am a 50 something white human with blue eyes and pale skin and short brown hair. Today I'm wearing a turquoise turtleneck sweater, and there's a soft focus behind me. And I'm really excited to be in conversation with Karen Lloyd. So, Karen, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Karen Lloyd, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am a 42-year-old fair-skinned woman with very long strawberry blonde hair and green eyes. I'm wearing glasses and a turquoise heart necklace and a teal sweater. I'm sitting in my living room today in Winooski.
Wonderful. And so the Green Mountain Disability Stories podcast is about stories of just people with disabilities in Vermont. And today we're going to be talking with you about, we'll start with a piece that's in the Cycles exhibition, Phoenix, and then we'll just see where the conversation takes us. So Karen, if you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your piece that's in Cycles, Phoenix.
Thanks, Heidi. So my piece, Phoenix Rising, is an acrylic on canvas, and the original is an 8 by 10. It was the first piece I'd done in a while, and it was a little over a month before my 40th birthday, so sort of the precipice of sort of that change of a new decade, and so a lot of self-reflection happening. And I hadn't done actually a more full-size painting in a while, but that one just hit me so hard and it really wanted to come out once that idea was planted. And so I worked on it for all the weeks basically leading up to my 40th birthday and finished it just before my birthday, which meant a lot to me to sort of have that timing. It really felt like, the phoenix is this mythological creature that sort of represents rebirth and transitions and overcoming and persevering. And, being a disabled artist now for, over a decade, it has felt like a symbol to me to sort of look to, um, even for like my own inspiration. So, I think sometimes people think like as an artist we're putting out to the world, but it's also sort of been my own inspiration back to me. And it kind of felt like a symbol of everything I've overcome, having Lyme disease actually starting when I was a UVM student. And the challenges that happened even just to get to graduation in a good way. And even then, persevering and graduating with honors, but that being very difficult and taking a lot more effort. Um, and then, going through like the past, 20 years really of um, struggling with all the effects of Lyme disease and what came through that as, fibromyalgia and the migraines and the brain fog and the fatigue. And so, like, hitting that 40 and looking both back and forward of, what is the rest of my life going to look like? And um, at the same time, I was just about to contemplate the big decision of divorce. So it was also a really big life stage change in my life as I was starting the Phoenix. And now I can look back 2 years later and I am officially divorced. And so, that, having that painting of mine to even look through during the past couple years now, um, has really sort of helped when it's been difficult and remembering, like the phoenix actually, it rises from its own ashes. So there is that fire and it might be pretty intense at times and seem really dark and not so fun. But in the end, the phoenix does come back and it rises and it's beautiful and it's strong and, it, really, is something that I've held on to. Um, this is sort of where it all began. And you can see I have, it's actually just like a TV tray table by my glass sliding door with the view of my garden beyond, because my garden is a big inspiration to me. It's my happy place when it's not snowing in Vermont. And so from like roughly May to October, that tends to be a place I hang out a lot. And I also have a few reference photos on my table of real peacocks. And I did that so that I could see just the way they move, the way their feathers go, and sort of get an idea of how does a real bird have motion. And I wanted that to sort of be loosely reflected in my Phoenix.
Yeah.
It was kind of wild the way I like drew the Phoenix is I didn't even really draw it. I painted the outline
Mm,
solid. And so that was even an interesting process because I didn't draw just like the like a thin outline and then go from there. I sort of
mm,
painted its body, if you will, solid if
yeah.
that makes sense, and then
Yeah.
built
Yeah.
up from there.
I was just going to say, as you're describing this, I'm hearing you um, just also articulate and say how different this process was for you, which, you know, is maybe some
Mhm.
version of a newness in the process for creating it, which may or may not be relevant. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, even though I did, but I wanted to
Oh,
share
that's
that in case
okay.
it escapes me. Yeah.
You know, I never even really thought about it before, but that's such a good point of there's actually quite a lot about the Phoenix that was me trying new things and it just working out that way. It wasn't like I necessarily even set out initially to, okay, let's see how many different things we can do.
Uh-huh.
But I guess looking back now, that's true. There was a lot to this process, even starting with the Sharpie drawing, which is not
Mm-hmm.
how I normally begin a piece of work.
Yeah.
And I think I learned a lot from this piece. And
Mm.
even the drive to make it was interesting, where because I had so much going on in my personal life, like contemplating divorce, that were really serious, I wasn't really feeling a lot of art mojo in general.
Mm-hmm.
And yet with this piece, it just so badly wanted to be born. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't going to take no for an answer. Like it had to come out of me, which as an artist feels really amazing because we don't always have that
Yeah.
drive to such a level. And I certainly don't. And there's times where we have to just push through with something. But this, it was the opposite, where like I could hardly wait to get to work on it again, even if it was at 2 in the morning. And
Mm.
um, so it was a lot of hours, but really happened through, you know, about a month really of
Yeah.
time, which for me is actually pretty fast because I'm a slow maker when it comes to original art, like paintings.
Yeah. I feel like we're getting this really intimate view of your process. So thank you for that.
Like I know we've talked about this in the past, Heidi, when we've done the networkings with inclusive arts, is that it ended up through the process and by the end of it feeling like a self-portrait. And
Mm-hmm.
that was sort of amazing too, because, you know, obviously I'm not a phoenix, I'm not a bird. And yet it ended up becoming sort of a symbol of myself is what it felt like. And so each
Mm-hmm.
little line really was a labor of love. And so even
Mm-hmm.
though it was very meticulous, it wasn't in a bad way, if that makes sense, as much work as it was to do it. I was glad to.
For this piece, I'm curious if the art, the creative process, you know, disability stuff, like, is there any parallel? And maybe you could describe, you talked about the blues and adding to the background to take away from some of the body of the Phoenix. Are there more visual details that you might add in now for the listeners as well?
Yeah, so I think it does sort of even correlate with being, a disabled artist, of having to think of new ways of doing things, can't
Hmm.
always rely on maybe what worked in the past. So, like for
Yeah.
myself, when I look back, I always feel like I had two lives in a way. So like pre-Lyme and after Lyme. I first got Lyme disease when I was 19, and so I was actually in the middle of being a college student at UVM when that happened. And it was the summer of 2002, and I was working at a horse stable because back then I was really strong and healthy and had a lot of energy. And even though I was a smaller person, I was very strong. And so mucking stalls, wasn't an issue. And I loved being able to be outside. I loved being able to take out the horses and having time with them. And then all of a sudden everything changed. And, getting to the barn one day and I could barely even pick up a pitchfork that was empty.
Mm-hmm.
Just the pitchfork itself was so heavy to me all of a sudden.
Hmm.
And that was the end of an era for me. Like I never regained how I used to be and only got worse for quite a long time. And so there's been a lot of having to relearn how to be in the world and changing even my identity, if you will, like how I view myself inside. And
Hmm. Hmm.
like having different limitations. And there's also, like you could say, on the flip side, there's other blessings too of having more empathy, that unless you've experienced something, you can never fully understand what someone else has gone through. And there's no way I would have really understood what it was like to have a chronic illness or disability if I hadn't gone through what I've gone through. And um, so I think, in some ways it does enrich our lives too. And, having that ability to understand more people than I would have ever had if I had lived my whole life being, really healthy and always being able to rely on myself. And with this Phoenix wing, it was like a part of it was broken off temporarily. It's literally missing a big
Hmm.
chunk of wing. And having to reimagine a new version of it
Hmm.
and having to trust that it could come out on the other side. And
Yeah.
I'm glad now that I did, because it's the new version and I was much happier with like it
Hmm.
just felt balanced, and I liked the flow of it so much better, just the way that the feathers are breaking off. Just felt right the second time. And so it was worth the it was worth taking the risk. Even though it was definitely nerve-wracking initially.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just appreciating the feelings and your experience as an artist and as a human. And my hands are moving now. I don't know if they're on the screen, but I'm
Mhm.
sort of in my body as I'm listening to you. And I just I don't know that I've considered how choice points and creativity also can bring the sensations of scared, in a way, as well
Mhm.
as excitement and joy and thrill. That's yeah, I think that's why I paused there and
Yeah.
just
But I
noticed it
think I
different.
already cared enough about the Phoenix at this point that I was
Mm,
afraid to ruin it.
mhm, mhm,
And I think as artists, there's always those pieces where we think, oh gosh, I went too far. I should have stopped earlier. And
yeah,
um, the one benefit to this being acrylics was it was a little bit easier to cover up as opposed to
mhm,
say if it was watercolors or something like that. Um,
yeah,
and so I'm glad that I pushed through, because I almost didn't. It would have been easier to just be like, okay, this is just the way it is.
mm, mhm,
Um, and I think even for myself in the past, especially the past couple of years, um, having to sort of look to things differently and getting creative with solutions for even just my daily life.
Mhm.
And, being a disabled person, I think a lot of people don't even think about how something as simple as taking out the trash would be something to have to
Mhm.
consider. But for myself, like because I can't do really heavy weight,
Mhm.
it was finding new ways that worked for myself so that I could be independent about it because
Mhm.
I have to ask someone for that help every single week didn't feel good either. And
Mhm.
so that balance of trying to find more ways that I could sort of live on my own that were not the way I had been living for like 18 years.
Yeah, yeah. It's just beautiful how this, to me anyway, that the story of your journey is coming through your description of the process for creating the Phoenix. Yeah. Yeah, and the detail that you're describing and the close-ups of so the painting is an 8 by 10, and
Hmm.
when we kind of get to the culmination, I'll ask if you can do sort of an overview of like the verbal description. But all of these details, I mean, this the I don't know how tiny like actually the brush strokes are, but I remember hearing how, I mean, just the detailed bits of it were so minute and so
Hmm.
deliberate that as you describe the details of what you've included in the piece, and other artists can have done this too. There's symbolism, there's meaning, so it's often more than just what you're looking at when you go to a deeper understanding of a piece. And I'm really hearing that now. Yeah.
Yeah, this piece, I definitely wanted to include a lot of symbolism of myself. And so even though it's not obvious because it's not like I put in, strawberry blonde white girl into the painting and there's no bunnies, there's no horses, it's not like it says Lyme disease on it or something. It felt like there were so many symbols that I snuck in, and
Mm,
so when I look at it, I it feels very personal, and
yeah.
so it was beyond just a very basic sort of phoenix symbol. Um,
It's just beautiful how this, to me anyway, that the story of your journey is coming through your description of the process for creating the Phoenix. Yeah.
thank you. And it's one piece of it that I'm actually especially proud of because
Mhm.
whether I was painting of like say a portrait of a pet or painting a mythological creature. I feel like the eye is really like the doorway to the soul, or the window to the soul, where it really gives an impression of its personality and really gives an overall sense of, okay, who is this creature? And with the phoenix, it was really important to me for it to have both the strength to it so that it seemed wise and it seemed strong and very sure of itself. But I also wanted it to show kindness and, um, for it to really feel like it's gazing at the viewer almost like with empathy. And so, even though it's a strong creature, it's not one that's out to harm. It's not angry. It's not, there's no ill intent with it. And I really felt like I was able to capture what I was hoping to with the eye. So for me, that was huge. And it's the tiniest little piece of the canvas.
Uh-huh.
But that little bit of canvas of its eye really, to me, is what really sort of brings it all together, because it's
Mhm.
really sort of the soul of the painting. And in this view of this close-up, you can also see its head feathers, and those were very deliberately chosen to do the three because I was thinking of like the Trinity, which was a nod to my faith. And also, I made them like little flames, both because it's a phoenix, but also
Mm.
because it was going to be my birthday. And so they're like little birthday candles.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah,
And
and
I'm
yeah,
laughing because I hear my I have a young teenager bunny. Speaking about bunnies, Sky is having fun playing in the background right now. So if you hear banging,
yeah, and my cats are quiet for the moment. So, um, you were just describing how personal this is to you, and
Mhm,
or maybe I was suggesting or remind the back and forth of that, and it's also, you know, this has been traveling this in the show traveling the state. It's been online. I think the phoenix symbolism is something that's very relatable to humans right now, and so while
mhm,
it's deeply personal, it also is kind of universal or relatable, and I think lots of time art can be that bridge for, from human to human. uh,
mhm,
yeah, so it's really, I'm smiling. Yeah, I've heard some of these details before just because we've known each other for a while, in
mhm.
the context that we have, but it's really fun to hear them again, and I hope the audience is appreciating, as well.
So its tail feathers were very much inspired by peacocks, and so they have the very classic peacock eyes. And to me, that was even a nod to, I was very much getting through the pandemic and just life in general with the help of meditation. And so, like, I was on Insight Timer in particular quite a lot. And so I felt like kind of like the head feathers being the Trinity to me
Mhm,
and that part of my faith that the tail represented um, that piece of my life of meditation and so like the third eye so I did three eye feathers so that was a very deliberate choice in number of tail feathers. So this is the completed phoenix. This was the final version and this is how people now see it out in the world. So we have the background with all its beautiful blues and teals and all that movement, and then the phoenix itself, basically centered on the canvas that was, as we said before, the 8 by 10, and its tail flows down to the lower right corner. So the very bottom of the tail actually touches the edge of the canvas on the bottom, and its wings are very open and widespread and up. So it has a very, to me, a very empowering feel because it's opened. The edges of the wing feathers, especially on the tops, are lots of goldens, so like yellows and oranges and very like flame, what we would think of as sort of flame colors, going into a deeper red as you get further into the wing, and then the most inner wing feathers being smaller and being shades of purples, so like lavenders, and then sort of like a wisteria purple and violets and sort of dark purples, and um, its face, it's turning to the left, and you can see its eye looking at the viewer, and it has the three head feathers with the little flames. Its beak is gray, and then as a nod to the peacock, it actually has a little bit of white markings around the face, which is otherwise red. And and then down it sort of has that longish neck like a peacock, and then going into um, its body being all reds, different shades of reds. And then it has gray for its legs and its feet with the little lavender toenails.
mm,
And then into the tail. And just like with the wings, the tail feathers also have some feathers that are disconnected. And so I thought of it as sort of the pieces falling away. So there's almost symbolic of discarding. So some of the feathers not needed anymore can just fall off. And so there's a bit of that. And um, even the idea of some feathers maybe growing in. So sort of, new appearing and the old that aren't needed anymore going away. And there's a little bit of tiny bit of purple detail at the base of the tail, and then it sort of goes into um, the real peacock-like feathers with the longer, I don't even know what to call them, like the little tendrils of yellow, and then the three eyes of the tail feathers.
Hmm. Thank you. Thanks so much, Karen, for sharing the details of your creative process with the Phoenix piece. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you want to share about the Phoenix, and then we'll kind of pull back and go to a broader sense of Karen as a disabled artist and what else you might want to share about that. So anything else about the Phoenix?
Sure. So what comes to mind to me is when it's been out in public, just the response from others, because it's such a personal piece to me. And so, of course, I put my own, sort of stories of, into the details in my mind. But anyone who's viewing it, they're not necessarily even knowing my stories, but hearing feedback from other people who saw it and how much it resonated for them
Mm,
and had such an impact for them really has meant a lot to me. And there's two different times that in particular that's really happened where the first was a couple years ago at the Champlain Valley Fair. I actually submitted it in the acrylic division, not for sale because I can't I can't have it sold, but it was on display. And the day that I went to pick it up, I never expected to have another, sort of like artist entry person come up to me and say anything. And this dad was so excited that I was there at the same time he and his son were, because it turns out that his child was so fascinated by my Phoenix to the point
mhm,
that even when they went home, he was telling his parents how it was his favorite piece in the whole
mhm,
Champlain Valley Fair art exhibit, which
uh-huh,
if any of
mhm,
you have been there before, it's huge. Like there's many different mediums, everything from photography to watercolors, acrylics,
mhm,
oils,
mhm.
and some sculptures, and a lot. It's, they usually have a few hundred people, and so it's not a small show by any means. And to hear that it had that effect on a young boy really meant
Mhm,
a lot to me, that he wasn't just in the moment like, wow, that's cool, that he actually was talking about it to his parents even afterwards and
mhm.
wants to create his own Phoenix because of seeing my
Uh,
Phoenix.
oh yeah. Well, I'm
So
smiling really, yeah. To
yeah, so
know
think
that
of
the
like
art,
inspiring like the next generation.
yeah.
And then the other, for me, really special moment just happened last Thursday. So basically, we had an art reception where I got to see you, Heidi,
Mhm,
because it was Inclusive Arts, the Cycles exhibit over at the University of Vermont at the CDCI uh, in their hallway, and getting to speak with a woman who also was really moved by the Phoenix and some of the things that she shared and how it was really resonating for her because of what she's going through in her life. And then even some
mm,
of the parallels of some of my stories and hers, even some of the commonalities.
mm,
Really powerful for me to sort of hear that. And, as an artist, most of the time I'm creating hoping that it has an impact to others. And this was unusually personal. And
mhm.
yet, I think more than maybe anything else I've done for painting, it's been the piece that has had an impact on others, which is really special.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that. And I'm so grateful that you had a chance to actually experience the impact of your art, from some people in the community. I think, often I heard from artists or hear from artists, and people create for themselves. Like there's a part
Mhm.
of creativity, and this is not like academic or anything, but it just seems like the human part. Like there's a part of creativity that we do for ourselves because we need to, because there's things inside that want to come out because we're inspired, and it's very
Mhm.
private. And there's this whole other part where it's like how it's received, the connections that it makes, the meaning that others receive from it, even if it's not exactly what the artist had intended. There's this sort of magical part of, or synchronous part of art being shared. So I'm really, really glad
Mhm.
to hear that you have that. And
Yeah, we don't always get to hear what the viewer's experience is, so it's even that is pretty special to actually get to hear the feedback in person because people are seeing art, but as the artist, we're often not there, so we don't get to hear, like what their experience of it is. So it meant a lot to me to get some of these bits of feedback.
yeah, yeah, beautiful. We're going to shift for a moment to sort of Karen as the artist with disability. So I'm curious if you want to like offer some thoughts about how disability and creativity and art kind of intersect or relate for you as Karen in this moment,
Mhm.
2024.
They very much so do because when I went to UVM, I was originally there as an animal science major, and then I got Lyme, and my brain didn't work the same anymore. And I realized realistically, being a veterinarian and going to veterinary school, it was just not going to be in the cards in this
Mhm,
life for me. And I switched to being an English major with an animal science minor. So I still kind of, because I almost had that major completed, so I sort of kept that too. But it was like graduating and then trying to work full time. My health was really impacting me, and I got to the point where it couldn't be ignored. It just got to a level where I couldn't hide it. I couldn't work around it enough
mhm,
anymore. And so it'd be 11 years ago now that I officially became legally disabled.
mhm,
And like my mom actually often will tell me that, she feels like God gave me the gift of art because I would need that as like a life purpose after sort of my own plans got changed. And when I was a young kid, I had that dream actually of being an artist. Like that was my original dream was to be an artist. I remember being in third grade and I really wanted to be an illustrator and also a writer. So I had these thoughts of, making these children's books that I would do everything I would do, all the beautiful illustrations that went along with the story.
mm,
And so in a weird roundabout way, like becoming disabled allowed me to focus on my art again in a way that I maybe wouldn't have had if I was working a full-time job and doing all the things that people do when they're not dealing with disability. And
mhm,
um, so it's tricky because all the things that make it difficult to have a real job still impact me as an artist too.
mhm,
So
mhm,
having the fatigue makes it hard to be as productive. Um, Having the brain fog makes it harder to, get anything done or to um, push through. And I actually struggle a lot with migraines, and so that's been a big limiting factor also. And so it's interesting because it's kind of this weird thing where on the one hand, disability allows me to be an artist in a way that I don't think I would have otherwise. But it also does create limitations for me that, I'm not a very fast producer of art. I'm definitely much more limited in my output than I wish I was. So,
mm,
that's sometimes hard of, especially nowadays when social media is huge and
mhm, mhm,
especially as an artist, it's helpful to be part of Instagram and Facebook to get our work seen.
uh-huh,
But sometimes it can be challenging to see what everyone else is doing who's able-bodied and who's healthy and they're able to like crank out all these pieces and it's like, oh, like, and so that struggle of having to not be so hard on myself that,
mm,
what they can do and what I can are not the same, and
Mm.
having to have some grace for myself that um, it's just that's just not my path as an artist. I'm not going to be the one who's, making record numbers of pieces and um
Yeah. As I as I listen to you describe that, I feel like the societal layers in my hands are kind of moving outward of, expectations and ableism and the ways that
mhm.
sort of intersects with life for disabled people. It's this
Yeah.
um, it's a part. And in some ways, society connects that with value that are I
Mhm.
feel like very misled and not true. But there's um, a lot to challenge with the monetizing of value. And
Mhm.
and this may not be the place for it, but to hear you talk about your art and what might be helpful for artists that don't have disabilities, it's not like apples and apples. For
Yeah.
some, is that accurate, or like maybe you have more
Yeah,
to say
that
on
really resonates. I think there is a lot of ableism that happens even within the art community. I think it's easy to think of artists and art community as being more progressive, and perhaps to some degree that is true. But I think there is a lot of ableism that it's so internalized that people don't even realize. And so there's a lot of comments that happen that people don't even understand how it comes off and how hurtful it can feel to those of us who are a disabled artist. Um, I have definitely struggled with that at times where, someone says something and it's like, whew, and
Mm.
I don't think they mean it the way it is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and
There's just like not an awareness often.
and I know worked through and continue to work through my own internalized ableism. So it's like a lot of the internalized isms.
Mhm.
And when I was hearing you, like all the productivity and the things that you sort of wish, for me that just I felt that in my heart, as because the world of what we kind of understand is valuable, or air quotes successful, is not always
Mhm.
the path. I think you said it very beautifully. So like that's not my path as an artist. So
Yeah.
um
And there was a lot of grief, when I left, I
mm,
was working at VSAC at the time, was my last full-time job, and there was a lot of grief in that officially applying for disability and basically admitting like I am disabled like that was hard. And I think a lot of that does come from even the internalized sort of anti-disabledness that we have in our society, that we all want to be able-bodied because that's what's celebrated. That's, you know what I mean? And like you said about value, I think it makes it harder for those of us who are going through something. And it's not like we have a choice most of the time. Usually we don't in these situations, and it's simply what is happening, and we have to learn to do the best we can with it. But um, I think for me, like, yeah, we all have, even those of us who are disabled, we still have that internalized because of the society that we grew up in and that we live in still, these expectations that are put on us by others, but also on ourselves. And so that's something that I definitely struggled with for a long time. And I think has gotten somewhat better,
mhm.
compared to 11 years ago when I was first dealing
Yeah.
with it. I think now I can even say a bit almost with pride, like, yes, I'm a disabled artist, whereas that would have been really hard, I think, initially to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, thank you for that that add on to the conversation, that initial question around the intersection of art and disability, for you, or creativity. And I would like to ask you next about sort of challenges you face as an artist, and then like
Mhm.
stay tuned for like what supports your creativity. So there's a both
Mm.
and to that, for this next little bit. So what you mentioned some of them, but just in case there's any that you didn't share, for
Mhm.
challenges and artists in Vermont. Yeah.
I think sometimes accessibility, if it's not with an organization, so say if there's an art reception, for example, if it's not with an organization like Inclusive Arts Vermont or, UVM, CDCI, where there's more awareness of what is even accessibility and what needs could artists maybe have, a typical art exhibit around here, at least in my experience, has been, for example, just a lack of chairs. And for
Mhm.
someone like myself, where I have a lot of physical pain and a lot of fatigue, and that varies. It varies on the day, it varies even within the day.
Mhm.
And on a rough day, especially, like, I really am going to need to be able to sit down. And if I don't have the ability to at all, that would mean having to leave early or not being able to attend. And so I've really appreciated, like, with VSA and then Inclusive Arts,
Mhm.
through all the exhibits that we've had, like having that as, you know, you know, just contacting you, like, to just let you know, like, hey, I need a chair by my piece, and to be able to have that as an option if I need to use it. And I
Mhm.
usually do at some point take a break, um
Mhm.
and it's hard, I think that's another thing with disability, people almost, I think, have this weird I don't know what to call it, like a limitation almost of like, oh, you need to be in like a wheelchair or on, using a cane to need,
Mhm.
that kind of accessibility, but that's not true. There's so many of us who are in between where, like, yes, I can walk and yes, I can stand, but I can't do it for as long as most other people can. And
Mhm.
so in my experience, that's something that I hope changes in general in Vermont
Mhm.
with art. When there is a big show and an art exhibit, that we have that open of, okay, what are needs? Maybe someone needs Braille for descriptions, maybe someone needs ASL, having an interpreter on site, whatever it is, to have that awareness of making it more inclusive, both for the participating artists, but also for the public who's coming in, who they might need those options too
Mhm.
for accessibility. And I'd love to see that change for the better.
Yeah. You were describing kind of the experience of a non-apparent disability, so that there's some stereotypical or not kind of just
Mhm.
what comes to mind and heart when somebody hears disability, like what they imagine. But there's
Mhm.
so many disabilities that are non-apparent that it sounds like you've had some experience trying to navigate that part of, inclusion for yourself.
Yes, I think it can be a double-edged sword. Um, Obviously, none of us would wish to be more disabled, but certainly when we're out in public, if we look on the outside, if we have a very invisible disability, I think it's easy for people to not respond in ways that are very helpful. And so, like, one thing I've noticed, being sort of presenting younger too, even though I'm 42 now, but often people think I'm younger than that. And um, but regardless, they know I'm not like a senior citizen and I'm not in a wheelchair. And so something as simple as getting groceries, for me, especially because I actually broke my back a few years ago, and that only added to some of my limitations. It never healed to be quite the same again, and so I have a lot of pain in my back. And so going to the grocery store, if I can have the cashier help with the bagging, because that motion really is hard on my body. And I've learned like which cashiers at which stores will be helpful and
Mhm.
which ones to avoid, and then which stores in general have a very good environment. So, like for me, like Healthy Living, I'll just give them a nice little soundbite because it's like they've been kind of a godsend to me as a customer, where they are across the board, everyone there has always treated me
Mm-hmm.
kindly and respectfully when I ask for help. There's no weird attitude. They're very respectful. They're happy to help me. And when I broke my back, they even would bring my groceries to my car for me, which meant a
Uh-huh.
lot. And so I think that's one thing that is so nice about Vermont being sort of that sort of smaller local. So like that being a local place and being more community oriented as opposed to
Mhm.
like a larger, you know, non-local company. And so that's something I've definitely faced though is by not being as obviously disabled.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's difficulty around that.
Yeah. Um, and I know you and I've talked in the past about some of those things and the sort of the challenges of like, being an artist, but then also being a human with a disability that
Hmm.
there's some overlap for sure. And if we don't mind switching or just kind of ask, you sort of went there with a shout out to healthy living, that what are things that support your creativity and your thriving? Like what are the things that work well for you, or that you have learned so you can work well with yourself in all of the different ways that you might show up, whether they're wanted or not. But
And are you asking like from a disability standpoint or just in general as
say then wherever you want. But what supports your creativity is the sort of question there. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, of all the things, and I know I've mentioned this to you before, but my favorite rock band is U2, and their music and the few times I've gotten to see them in concert have been especially going to see them in concert has been such a blessing when that's happened. And I never feel as alive as I do in those moments. And there's just something about the music. And I guess it's because it is sort of that creative energy. It's, those of us who are artists, it's like whether it's music or a painting, there's a similar energy there. And I always do my artwork with music. And most
Mhm.
often that means YouTube music. So, so I usually have YouTube songs playing, and it's almost like part of me because I've listened to them so much. And so there's a flow to hearing it that's different than if it was, say, listening to the radio, for example,
Mhm. Mhm.
because I know those songs so well and they they bring me joy. And there have been times, even if I'm making, say, like my cards, because I make my own art prints and then I put them on cardstock and make them into cards. And sometimes my body is just like, oh gosh, like I am so exhausted, and maybe my back is really hurting because I've been bending over. And there's usually a certain point where, gosh, I'd rather be doing anything else because my body is just so done. And by putting on some YouTube music usually helps me to keep going longer than I would otherwise. It's a nice distraction and helps keep my mind off of like some of the pain a little bit. And obviously it can only do that for so long still, but it does help. And um, another big inspiration for me is definitely my bunnies. You know,
Mhm.
they're they're such loves. And um, like I feel like I really got through the last couple years, especially because of my bunnies.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. Just a couple more questions. And one is, what advice would you give to other artists with disabilities in Vermont?
I think the biggest one I would give would be to become part of the community, if you will. And so, like for myself, that actually happened because of VSA, which now is called Inclusive Arts Vermont. So, having an exhibit that was centered around disabled artists, it just gives a different feel than when it's in a broader exhibit, which I've also been part of, and those are amazing in their own ways. But there's something to be said about being in the room with other people who can understand on a deeper level, and we sort of share similar experiences. And even though our individual stories might have specific differences, and we might have a different reason for being disabled or a different diagnosis, whatever it is, but there are common layers underneath all of that, which is really special. And that sense of community has been really, really powerful and wonderful in my life, and something that I really treasure. And I just feel like there's a support there that is unique to anything else. And um, some of the connections have actually turned into friendships for me too, which has been really quite special and unexpected. And so I think, to find those avenues. And one thing that through the pandemic was really helpful for me, both personally, but also as a disabled artist, was when Inclusive Arts Vermont had a networking over Zoom, and we would meet once a month, and we would share our projects and maybe share ideas of what we were hoping to do or brainstorming together. And um, one thing actually that came out of that for me with my art was with the Phoenix to display it without a frame, because another artist sort of mentioned that, and having it feel free and not caged in with a frame. And so it was amazing even from that, where we can sort of learn from each other and get inspired. And so I would really recommend for other disabled artists to try to find whatever that is, like your community of people, and to reach out.
Yeah, thank you. I've heard so many artists talk about this solo and other artists in cycles, and there's a part of art that's individual, and we need each other, and so that
Hmm.
balance. Yeah, and I was because I was part of the networking that you were describing, the Phoenix. You brought that to the group, and I was remembering that the suggestion to not have it be trapped with a frame. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I love that suggestion because it was so true. It was really appropriate to have it feel free like that. And so that is how it's displayed now, is without a frame.
And thank you so much, Karen. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we wind down our conversation? It's been so wonderful to be in dialogue with you about art and creativity and all of the things. What else do you want to share? Anything else?
Well, for me, it's been pretty amazing just the timing of the Cycles exhibit, because of course it traveled to different locations around the state of Vermont, but it started at the UVM Davis Center. And then it ended at UVM CDCI, and it's that organization's 50th anniversary this year. And for me, it's my 20th anniversary of graduating from the University of Vermont. So of all the pieces, for it to be my Phoenix and get to have it at two different locations at UVM this year, I just felt like that timing of that in particular was really special. And it meant a lot to me, because I loved my time at UVM, and to sort of still have that connection to it in a way, and um, for it to be through such a special piece of mine with my art, I was glad that that could happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Karen, and thanks for sharing more details about and the intimacy of the process with your piece in Cycles Phoenix, and um, your connection with others who've responded to it, and just sharing your beautiful, vulnerable, artistic, creative human self today with me and with the audience. Appreciate
Thank
that.
you so much, Heidi. It's
Yeah,
always a joy speaking with you.
yeah.